Welcome to another Smart QA Musings, this is a little special because it is the 50th edition. So I guess you understand that the big M stands for the Roman word of M, the 50. And today's discussion, or today's musings really, is titled as Reflections on Inflexion. And the inflection point, as we know today, probably is, the AI that happens to be there. This particular musings was really inspired when I read this report, which is the Future of Jobs report from the World Economic Forum, whose link is also there, which if you may want, it's a fairly decent, detailed report. And when I was reading this report, we were seeing some pictures, especially some of these pictures in the report which talked about the shift in skills that is required in 2030. And of course, remember, this report is not specific to software. This is in general skills as required in possibly in the future. I think it was titled 2030. What caught my attention at that point was 4 quadrants. It displayed 4 quadrants of skills. And quadrant 1, the leftmost one, which seemed to say out of focus skills. And then skills which are related as out of focus, emerging, study. And then there was the last quadrant which talked about core skills. And what really caught my attention, which I'm quite sure all of us would probably appreciate and agree, is when you look at the out of focus skills, it specifically mentioned 2 items. And one of the item was, it said programming is out of focus skills. Quality control is an out of focus skills. I mean, I'm sure these words are pretty common and we relate to it very deeply. And I said, yes, we all probably would like to not want to think about it that way. But the truth is, it's probably getting to be there, which I'm sure we all in some form or fashion see today. And then that got me thinking and said, hey, if this is what it is, what does it really mean? What does this entire map mean? And that's how this idea came about. And we said, maybe it will be an interesting thing to muse about this. So the 50 weeks that we've been exploring Smart QA has been very quiet. It's been a simple one. It's been not been loud or sharp. It's been just nice, gentle musings. But today it's an interesting turning point. Happens to be the 50, also happens to kind of come to a close to 2025. And today I thought it might be interesting, therefore, to explore the inflection. And as I gave the preview of this entire stuff, today we talk so much about AI today as central to a lot of things that we do. Code, engineering, and a lot of other things. We use AI probably in a lot of other things, writing, recognition, and all kinds of stuff. So it seems to me that we're slowly kind of embracing, if you will, AI as a co-worker. Right. So the question here is, what happens if we kind of go into the future and start thinking about it, not necessarily predict? What would QA look like when we work with AI co-workers? And of course, the other things which are not necessarily software-centric, but the larger context of change, climate concerns. If you go beyond engineering, geopolitics, which is fragmented, the pressures of economics, which we face not just as an individual, but as a country and the world. So there are a lot of these larger systems that are probably shaping the things to come, and therefore the skills that we need possibly to survive and grow. Right? So this is not just about a discussion only on the technical side. There are other things that are shaped. And therefore, what could possibly a quality professional become or look like in 2030? Remember, I'm not trying to kind of say, look, this is my prediction. I don't think I'm calling it prediction, but it's more like saying, let's muse about it and think about it, inspired by this report. Like all inflection point, as we know, as we read, is only felt after it's gone. It looked very sharp in hindsight, but they really arrive quietly, softly, without you knowing it. That's what inflection is. And now we know inflections occur in very many ways, right? It could be in politics, it could be in it could be in businesses, it could be in technology. But when you start seeing a set of inflection, which like, right now seems to be this, before it was cloud, before it was components, object-oriented programming, variety of different stuff, right? Web. They all begin as questions. They don't begin as upheavals. And then it shifts in attention. And then it changes in how we think and how we interpret. Right? And so the newer world that we're dealing with is probably something like this. As we go forward, we are seeing that, the AI is kind of, in some sense, a part of what we do. It's kind of, like it or not, it's going to be a co-worker. We probably have it on our laptops and PCs and also phones today, right? The new world is not just about AI. Systems are severely multi-layered. They're also fairly interesting because there's a certain amount of prediction issues that's happening because we're not building necessarily deterministic systems. We are also building non-deterministic code, which is part of AI in some sense, and there is therefore a challenge of certain degree of unpredictability. Today, we all know that, with AI and data centers, I'm sure all of us appreciate the fact that there is a lot of data centers, AI data centers that are being built, which consume an enormous amount of power. They consume a lot of water. So they do put pressure on the environment. So sustainability is a key aspect that is being thought through and has to be part of engineering decisions. So if it's part of engineering decisions, we cannot sit outside of the fence because we are part of very much engineering. Regulations. There are so many different regulations that are coming in. I'm sure we all appreciate the notion of privacy today, the copyright regulations of AI, and so many other regulations that are coming into picture. Of course, in the politics side, you've been hearing of tariffs. And of course, the pressure of economics, because now we're really asking, how can we do stuff more faster? How can we get more money? How can we increase profitability? How can I cut down humans? Right? Because we are looking at severe amount of efficiencies. So I'm sure you must have heard of some of the statements of some of the people like Elon Musk, where they said, look, I think humans won't have work in the future. That's a bit of an extreme, but I guess you get the drift. So there's a fairly newer world that we are going into, and in this process, the engineering is also severely bending. Software is not very deterministically stateful. It is in some sense stateless, which we appreciate even when we do web programming, right? And today we have models which learn, which also drift. And it also kind of reasons, probably sometimes ambiguously. The behavior today is no more the part of the logic. Behavior is in large sense driven by data. So if I can poison the data, I can change the behavior of a system, which I'm sure you must have seen some interesting stories about them. Systems are adaptable today. You can ask it to change itself and it'll probably change itself, not just in terms of switches, but I guess you can even generate some code. Finally, the notion of correctness itself is probably not necessarily deterministic. So you can't really say this is exactly right or wrong. You can say reasonably right. So there's a notion of probabilistic notion that is coming into picture, which I'm sure we all appreciate. Recognition is one of those areas, right? You know that whatever pictures are being recognized is probabilistically correct. Not necessarily always. So we're looking at numbers. So we have kind of in a way moved from does it work to in some sense looking at how does it behave? How does the system behave under shifting conditions? So while the engineering is bending and morphing in the larger new world, there is a disruption that's probably, in some sense, slowly happening into the way we look at testing and QA. Nonetheless, there will be systems which are old. Nonetheless, there will be systems which have been constructed, which are not necessarily AI. They will still demand some work. We are not saying that everything is going to shift, because shift is always a certain gradual stuff until it overtakes. So when you look at a disruption, if you use the idea of the notion of human, or to use the colloquial word called manual and think of it as checking, And think of it as, automation and scripted and deterministic validation on the left side, which the last one may not be 100% true, because we know that every requirement today is not as detailed as we would like it to be. But then there is a shift from the left to the right. And I think we are seeing the drift where there are probably interesting arguments that happen where you say, oh, tests are generated by AI. And some people are saying, man, if everything was generated by AI, if the code was generated by AI and tests were generated by AI, then what the heck is happening? It doesn't sound right. We'll talk about that later. So there is a shift in terms of how AI is probably coming into mainstream with a lot more tools that help you in the context of testing, going as far as probably even generation. And of course, today we have tools which probably help you even in speccing, designing, coding, testing. So the shift is the notion of artifacts, the act of oracles in terms of probabilistic systems, the notion of behavior and context becoming obviously far more deeper than what we could ever imagine, has been around for a long time anyway. And lastly, of course, the idea that it is no more just an act of validation, which to me is like probing. You're trying to probe and understand and figure out and constantly look out for where am I going to disrupt the guardrail. And that's where the hypothesis comes in. So that's a kind of a shift that's probably happening, which means it's a shift from the mechanical world of evaluation or brute force checking to a lot more intellectual work, which results in probably obviously thing that I always focus on, asking more questions, being very critical, and it's not just about execution. Not that execution is not important, but that's probably not going to be the mainstay. Right? So the shift is no more a watcher of behavior. A QA is more of an imaginer of how the system may behave. So I think as the systems become intelligent, I think we have to also evolve, right? We have to go to the next level. Because if certain amount of cognition is taken care of by a system, then we have to evolve into the next level of cognition, intelligence, and that is where I think cognitive skills become far more important in the newer world as systems morph, and therefore it becomes in some sense the QA superpower, so to speak, right? Because every technology pushes us upwards to do something higher, right? In our case, this is about intellectual thinking. So when you look at it, when we look at, let's say, quality and look at it from how can I view the quality? Are there different ways to look at it? Is it just a product notion? We have probably been fairly focused on product quality. Given a system to test, consider a product or an application, our focus is, does it work? We've also looked at it as we evolved. We also started looking at it from, hey, does it mean well to the user experience? It's not just about product working in terms of functional aspects or non-functional aspects, but it's also the experience that the user has. The third horizon has actually moved on to a notion of value. Does it help the business who's consuming the system? And today I think we have a more bigger question to ask, because we are using probably intelligence where the learning has been from a collective, it has learnt it from the world at large. So that means it's got all kinds of knowledge, some right, some wrong, and we are now harnessing that intelligence, and therefore we are really asking, we don't control the full knowledge, so is the system that we are building, which uses this knowledge, which is intelligence, is it now behaving responsibly? Is it really fair? And therefore we are asking larger societal questions, trust, fairness, explainability, etc., which are really related to the notion of AI. So think about these as the four horizons of quality. I'm sure that we understand the first and probably the second and third. And probably the third and the fourth become more and more important as we go forward, right? So if I were to kind of look at in detail about what it is, product horizon is really about the simple notion of does it work, correctness, the non-functional aspects of reliability, performance, etc. They form the foundation. but they no longer define the boundary of QA. Right? Whereas when we talk about experience, we're talking about the notion of how good it is to the end users, which I'm sure we all appreciate. We know UX and stuff like that. The whole idea here is cognitive overload. So we want the system to be simple, means it does not just mean looking great. It's simple or looking nice. It is about reducing my ability to think and do. So therefore, I'm constantly asking a question about clarity. So clarity in a way becomes an interesting testable attribute. Right? Is it clear? Is it clear to the users as to what they want to do? And remember, it may not always be anymore a front-end based interface, because we have multimodal interfaces today. You could look at it, you could type at it, you could talk to it, you could even probably going forward gesture with it, and so on and so forth. So there is the clarity in terms of how the system behaves is no more limited to a particular mode, right? So we're not just assuring the software today, we probably are assuring in some sense its consequences, right? And that's what we're doing. And that's when the third thing of value comes into picture. When we talk about value, we are not just saying right or wrong. We are sensing. We are doing a bit of telemetry. We are trying to find some signals, hide the noise, discard the noise, and probably sense better to know if there is risk, if there is value, if the value is higher, is my effort aligned with the outcomes. So it's not about just finding issues and fixing issues that we're talking about. We're really looking at how we behave, how we change our behavior, very focused on the notion of sensing the value, the proposition that we are building and delivering. And of course, the last one being the societal influence, because I think we're really talking about a lot of other things, not necessarily technology orientation, right? It's about fairness. Is the system being fair? Does it have bias? Is it being transparent? Is it sustainable? Is it trustworthy? And so on and so forth. And those become possibly certain newer attributes that we probably have to keep in mind when we validate systems with intelligence, in whichever form or fashion. So that's a shift. That's probably we need to be cognizant about. To kind of look at the report, not that you will be able to read this picture, but I just thought I'll put it in place. This is what I was mentioning, the 4 quadrants. The leftmost quadrant being the out of focus. And if you watch very carefully, somewhere up here, let me see if I can mark it here for you, is programming. And if you look here, it's quality control. It says it's out of focus. What does it really mean? It simply means that today certain of the lower level perceivably these have become lower level activities in some sense that can be significantly done better by a machine. So you can prompt to generate code, which I'm sure we call as vibe coding today. Similarly, you can give a spec, it will generate some test cases, not necessarily the good ones, not necessarily all of them being good, but it will get you a good starter. So I'm not recommending or suggesting that you just dump it and use it to generate code and test cases, not really. But what we're really saying is we have over time acquired a lot of skills, and suddenly we have to be careful with those because they can be done better because you've got far more intelligent systems. So that's what this is. Now when you look at the emerging or study skills, things that are probably still required, like empathy, that's on top. Having a service orientation and customer service orientation, right? So those are still study skills, they cannot go away. And if I take some ideas of emerging skills, you will find that environmental stewardship. So when we are building large scale systems or systems that are small but they're in the hands of many millions of people, I will have to worry about maybe at times time goes by, is it environmentally friendly? How much of carbon is it emitting? I'm sure all of us understand every search that you do, every prompt that you run, you're blowing away a lot of electricity and therefore carbon and polluting the atmosphere and so on and so forth. So there is an environmental impact a significant impact that is attributed to today technology, no more limited to the guzzling cars. It's also due to the buzzing computers. And finally comes the core skills of 2030, so to speak, where on the topmost it talks about AI and big data, literacy of technology, resilience and flexibility, and so on and so forth. I'm not trying to go through all that stuff, but I'm sure if you'll go look at this, the content that's available on the net, you might find it very illuminating. It is a fairly detailed report. It talks about the skills by country and different domains and what it means and so on and so forth. But net, it seems to be that at least about a little less than half of these skills will shift, which is pretty dramatic, right? Because we suddenly have to deal with a lot more cognitive complexity. We have to learn to co-work with AI. Becomes foundational skill. We can't think in the small. We need to think in terms of systems. The larger general systems thinking becomes essential. The ability to be resilient and adapt probably is the most important skill that we will have to go forward. And of course, humankind has always been a survival mode, right? It's not that we are unknown to adaptability. But then what we're seeing is much more faster change, and I think that's where the challenge comes. So the words, if you look, the skills curve is kind of bending towards deeper thinking, because systems are smarter, systems are apparently becoming more intelligent, so you have to elevate your intelligence, and therefore the thinking skill becomes more interesting. So that's why the QA is more of bending towards from checking and evaluating to sense making. I'm only sensing things rather than finding only, right? And therefore, if you detail this, what this means, and if you look at it, try to interpret that, putting in the QA context, which is the liberty I've taken, some of these may be like this, with the QA context applied. Cognitive skills, which are related to reasoning, hypotheses, which are to be depth. So things like analytical thinking, innovation, different forms of thinking, as you see, analytical, creative, systems, are becoming more important and interesting. The ability to reason about complex systems, situations is becoming more interesting. The need to handle ambiguity and uncertainty becomes probably more interesting. So like that, if you continue to go down and look at technical skills, we are saying it's no more, you can't be averse to technology. You need to look at probably being more AI aware, like understanding models and prompts and hallucinations and all that stuff, right? Becomes probably important. Understanding about, systems that are cloud and distributed, and safety aspects and security aspects become important. Interpretation of large data. The ability to observe and make some judgments, the observability of large-scale systems are technical skills. And the third and the fourth skill, which is the blocks of interpersonal and resilience, is interpersonal is more about how you manage to influence other people. How are you able to articulate better? How are you able to influence stakeholders? How are you able to empathize and advocate users? How can you storytell risks, not just stories of what you want, right? And if you go to the last one, resilience, it's about, obviously, constantly being fluid. Fluid means constantly adjusting, evolving, being curious, being self-directing, continuous learning, and so on and so forth. So as we go forward, probably it's no more just about tools. QA may not be defined only by tools. It's probably going to be more defined by the clarity of thought. So I'm going to take maybe another few more minutes. So this is going to be an interesting piece. And that's the question is, hey, if a prompt creates a spec and later it creates the code, what do I need to do? Do we need test cases? Of course, it's a very farcical question, because today prompts can do anything you want. So I'm kind of imagining, here is a prompt, it writes a spec, it comes up with a design, writes a piece of code, also generates a test case, and what the heck should I do? And that's the inflection. It's shifting from checking to sensing, verification to coherence, test cases to behavioral boundaries. And these are tectonic shifts. What we are looking for is the final statement. We are not looking for engineering the correctness. We are actually designing the guardrails, because everything, as we go forward, prompts would become a significant portion of how we use, because we usually use some form of fashion of AI. So what we are trying to do is to set guardrails so that it doesn't go out. Right? It's not any more deterministic as we earlier understood. So I guess if you look at it from prompt to spec to code in a prompt-driven world, sometimes you might even ask, why do we need some of those? Do I need test cases? Do I need specifications? Or can I just say, hey, this is what I want, and here is, lo and behold, here is a system that comes. Of course, that's a bit of a notorian, but it's not too far. So in that case, what happens to some of the intermediate artifacts? Do they still hold valid? Do I still need all those? Because those intermediate artifacts of spec and code and design and stuff like that were needed when humans did it. If it's not only human who does some of these, then we have to really re-examine what they mean. And therefore, we might have to really re-look at some of the artifacts of what we do and say, is it sufficient to look at the conventional notion of test cases? Or is it more like test intentions or test challenges or counterfactual thinking? What do we mean by that? We mean test intentions. So what are we trying to learn? What are the assumptions that must be challenged? Because those are the ones that are probably, in some sense, embedded as part of the prompts that we use to exploit intelligence in a large system. Similarly, in terms of challenges, we're trying to figure out how to disturb, how to perturb the behavior across context, states, forcibly put some contradictions and sees how it behaves, which I'm sure all of us have experienced when we play around with some of these AI systems today, as in terms of Claude or, with Gemini or ChatGPT and something. And lastly, the notion of counterfactual thinking, because you can't just say, you generate the code, you generate the spec, you generate this case. That doesn't sound sensible at all. So we are more interested in figuring out what variations or edge contexts or model inferences are missed, are diverging, right? And those are the things that probably become a realm of what we mean by some of the artifacts of test. And therefore, the newer artifacts is no more what we conventionally call today. It might be something like these. I'm just imagining and putting in some words up there to give you a sense as to what I'm musing about. The newer artifacts will be more of hypothesis-driven questions to probing strategies, narrative-driven contexts, which are more conceptual scenarios, maybe trying to find maps where we can discover potential fragility of a system, ethical guardrails where boundaries must not be crossed. So we're trying to, because it's not deterministic, right? So truly the artifacts are not about reproducibility alone. It is about discoverability to a larger degree. And if you go further up, maybe this is how some things may look like. We may not lose the conventional notion, we just outgrown them. Remember, once upon a time we learned a lot of arithmetic ways to do things, maybe how to compute a square root. Now you don't even know them because you just use a calculator. We have outgrown that. So we have outgrown some of the methods that we learned, right? Simply because technology allowed it to do better. Similarly, when you look at the left side as typical QA, and you look at what does it mean of QA in the context of systems which are intelligent, I think there is a shift. It's no more checking, but it's challenging. It is no more scripting, but it's about intelligence. It's no more coverage, it's about more of curiosity. It is no more about pure test cases, but it's about probes and models and perspectives and so on. It's no more a production activity. It is a thinking discipline. And that's probably where we are headed, outgrowing them. And therefore, what does it mean? What could be some of our roles? I'm not saying these are designations, okay? These are role-like identities. So am I just a tester, or would I be called something like an AI-aware assurer? Fancy name, right? So my job is to find out if the system is hallucinating. the system is drifting, the system is brittle. Or maybe my role is something like a signal interpreter. I'm looking for anomalies or patterns or sense making in terms of putting in telemetry systems. Or maybe I'm a custodian of experience and I'm trying to find out friction, flow, cognitive load. So these are all, in a way, probably variations of emerging QA modes, right? These are not necessarily designations. So this is from as an individual standpoint, this is probably what the skill requirement therefore is, which I think we have talked about quite a bit in detail. The QA now requires these notions of, these skills in some sense of cognitive clarity, technical depth, behavioral influence, and we talked about the 4 pillars, right? And therefore, as we go, I think there's also going to be an expectation change in terms of what managers, some of you, are going to expect out of your people. You may want them to join conversations much earlier, challenge some assumptions, deeply collaborate with certain AI tools, constantly be sensing risks, going beyond the typical notion of components and stuff that we build, and quite naturally, which we all do today, continuously upskill in that kind of context or whatever the context is of interest. So there is a shift in terms of not the role and the skills and what I need to do, but also in terms of expectation. And therefore, if AI writes and tests and deploys and monitors, which is what is seemingly happening, what remains uniquely human in quality? I think it's a craft of seeing further. It's this craft now changes to being more curious, being more discerning, being more judging ethical aspects, being more empathetic. So you see here, we're not talking about only pure technical stuff. So we're actually expanding ourselves, elevating ourselves higher beyond the typical realm of quality into some part of engineering and more beyond of engineering, right? And finally, it's like, looking at beyond curiosity, etc., imagination, the courage of asking obviously uncomfortable questions, which I'm sure we are all doing today. And finally, the wisdom in sensing more interesting patterns of complex systems, which today can be guided and aided by AI systems. So, to kind of conclude, probably inspired by this WEF, the World Economic Forum Skills Report 2030, maybe the craft of testing or QA is probably in seeing further than code, further than tools, further than what today we see as today's certainty. It is possibly discovering what we couldn't imagine we needed to build. It's a kind of a crazy statement, the last one. We couldn't imagine what we needed to build. And that's probably a drift. That's probably things to come. With that, this is what I thought could be an interesting musing, more so for me, because, the report was a very, very detailed, structured notion of putting together the idea of the drift. Well, thank you so much.